Hello, folks. Welcome back to our reading guide of Vladimir Lenin's State and Revolution. Today we will be covering Chapter 4, Parts 1, 2, and 3. Lenin here is going to be talking about what Engels has to say about social democracy, anarchism, and the Paris Commune. Chapter 3 was what Marx had to say about a lot of these things, and here Lenin's going to be talking about the specifics of what should be done with the state and the specifics of what makes Marx's thought different from the thoughts of anarchist thinkers and of social democrats, and how people at the time when Lenin is writing this are distorting these views. Because as I try and bring up every time, Lenin is writing this for the context of the Russian Revolution. So some of the things he's going to talk about here are going to be specific, but most of it is still very applicable. So the first part is called the housing question, and this is taking from a work by Engels called The Housing Question, and Lenin basically finds the most important parts as they relate to the state and what needs to be done with the state. So Engels says that housing right now is, or at his time, was controlled by the market, supply and demand, same thing as today. But post-revolution, one of the very first steps of the workers will be to seize the housing and distribute it to everybody. So there's more, today, this is fast forwarding to modern day, there's more empty houses than there are, than there are homeless people, right? So why can't you move the homeless people into the empty houses? It seems like common sense. Well, because housing is determined by supply and demand. If you allowed homeless people to live in houses for free or for cheap, then landlords wouldn't be able to make a profit off housing, and you would have to eliminate landlords completely. Which is exactly what Engels is saying needs to be done. In order to transfer housing from the landlord class to the working class, you need the state. You need the state to take it, seize housing from the landlords, and transition it to the proletariat. And this is the job of state power after the workers' revolution. And so right now the state functions as a tool of the landlords, right? So if you don't pay your rent, the landlord will take you to court. The court is a bureaucracy or a function of the state. And if you still don't leave your house after the court rules that you have to leave your house, the police will come and forcibly force you to leave your house, enforcing private property rights. So you see how police and the courts and the state serve as a tool of the landlord, right? To enforce private property rights. If you don't pay your rent to the landlord, the state will come and kick you out of your house because that house belongs to the landlord under the laws of capitalism. As we move to socialism, the state will be needed to take the houses and nationalize them and take them from the hands of the landlords and move them into the hands of the working class. And landlords can get houses too, they're just not allowed to profit off of housing because that makes no sense. So this is a change in the function of the state. So state power is needed. Already talked about that. And then Engels talks about how the state will be needed too to collect like rent during the transitionary phase. So ultimately we want to get to communism, right? This phase where there's no exchange value, where there's no commodity form, where money isn't this ultimate commodity that we all chase after because it can be exchanged for any other commodity. But you can't eliminate money on day one of the revolution. So there are going to be workers who work on houses, not landlords who profit from housing and who collect 50% of your paycheck at the end of every month for sitting on their butt. But the workers who maintain the housing and build the housing, a small amount of rent will need to be collected by the state in order to make sure those workers are well paid. It's going to be way cheaper once you eliminate the profit of landlords, but since exchange value still exists, you're going to need the state to serve this administrative function in the transition period from socialism to communism. So Lenin says a lot of people ignore Engels' quotes in this chapter that Lenin's using about the transitionary phase. And a lot of people at the time are distorting Engels and calling him an anarchist. They're saying, look, Engels talks about the withering of the state. Engels very clearly says his ultimate goal is the abolition of the state. Therefore, Engels is an anarchist and he doesn't want us to seize state power. Lenin is saying, no, Engels is saying right here, this is an example of Engels saying you need state power to first transition the ownership of housing from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. proletariat. And landlords are just a really easy example to think about. And Lenin says that Soc Dems, Social Democrats, are distorting Marx and Engels at the time, so we can't specifically see where they differed from anarchists. Because like I said, this is happening in revolutionary Russia. So they've had their revolution, and they're like, what do we do now? So Lenin's laying out exactly, this is what Marx and Engels said, and the Social Democrats are saying, Marx and Engels are anarchists. Don't listen to them. They just want to abolish the state, right? We need to keep the state and slowly move the state so it's more beneficial for workers. That's what social democracy is. We'll just go vote every year, and slowly workers will gain more power through the state and more protections, and the state will start to protect labor. Lenin's saying, no, that's not what Marx and Engels Marx and Engels are very clear. You need to seize state power and use it for the transition of the means of production from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat. So that's the end of part 1, and now we'll move on to part 2. So now moving on to part 2, the critique of anarchism. And I know a lot of anarchists really dislike this part of the chapter because they think it distorts what anarchism actually is. So just keep that in mind, but I'm just going to read what Lenin, Marx, and Engels say here. And you can talk to an anarchist about their beefs with this chapter if you want to know what they are. But I am not an anarchist. So in 1973, Marx and Engels have a polemic against anarchists, Proudhonists, or anti-authoritarians, right? People who are averse to authority and are nervous about the state having too much power. So Marx says anarchists are overly critical of political action and seizures of power. He says, workers commit the terrible crime of outraging principle to satisfy their needs. So Marx is saying anarchists look at the workers looking to seize state power, and they say, no, this is too authoritarian, stop it. And Marx is saying, no, this is what needs to happen. The workers are exploited, hungry. Some of them are homeless. They need to seize state power, even though it takes authority, or, they're seizing power and authority to do so and use it to satisfy their needs. Because they're living in relative misery right now, because capitalism is a system which leaves the masses in misery, and state power is necessary to change that. So Lenin says Marx and anarchists both have the same goal. They both want to abolish the state, but Marx recognizes that workers must first use the organized force that is the state to abolish class and bourgeois oppression. Basically what we were talking about in the last chapter. The workers need to seize the state and use it to transfer the means of production. Marx is very clear that he agrees with anarchists except for when they want workers to lay down arms after the revolution. Marx says the revolution must first defend itself and dismantle the instruments of bourgeois oppression before the state is withered. So you have a lot of Marxist-Leninist states that have come into existence, and we talk about this a lot. They develop these militaries and state bureaucracy. But globally, the bourgeoisie has continued to oppress these countries, right? Most recent example I can think of, because I was writing about it earlier today, is Bolivia. Bolivia controlled state power, but there's still a bourgeoisie existing within the country, in a far-right fascist dictatorship seized power with the backing of the West, right? You need to hang on to state power, and there are things you're going to need to do after the revolution to defend yourselves, to ensure the transfer of the means of production to workers and the movement to socialism. And what we've seen is, socialism in one country hasn't necessarily been able to do this, right? The state hasn't started to wither, and to protect themselves from the ruling or from the capitalist class. They've had to do a lot of things. They've had to really centralize power, and in places like the Soviet Union and even in China, there were a lot of excesses as far as like who was purged and whatnot. So, just thought there's me being an anarchist and critiquing this a little bit, but I still definitely think workers need to seize state power, and I think Bolivia is doing the right thing. And even Bolivia is not Marxist-Leninist; they do things through voting. But anyways, so the workers, after they seize the state, need to use the state to defend themselves from bourgeois counter-revolution and dismantle the instruments of bourgeois oppression. So, Engels said that Proudhonists have a dogmatic aversion to authority. Engels says to imagine a vessel at sea, and a vessel at sea needs some kind of authority to function, right? You need like a captain telling his workers what to do. Organization is needed to make things function. And some form of authority is going to be needed. Marx and Engels, there's a misconception that they wanted full equality, that they had an aversion to authority. That's not what they said. They recognize that some form of authority and management are needed. It's the exploitation and the using of surplus value for the enrichment of a minority that isn't needed. And the allowing of that minority to determine what humans do with what is produced by human labor, that is wrong. There's nothing wrong with minor authority. And I think of this, as far as wrestling, or in terms of wrestling, everyone knows I wrestle. And in wrestling, you need a coach. I'm coaching now. I transitioned from being a wrestler to a coach, and it is authority in a sense, but you need coaches, right? You need people to make sure that the team keeps functioning and that everything's going according to plan. This doesn't mean the coach should have authority to kill you or throw you in jail for a minor crime, right? They're there to protect you, to help the whole organization that is the team flourish. And that could be considered a form of authority. So this pathological aversion to authority doesn't make any sense, according to Engels and according to me. So Engels says that authority is relative to the existing social system. So some forms of authority are inevitable and will still be needed in socialism or communism. He says the anti-authoritarians want to abolish the state before abolishing the social relations which caused the state to come about in the first place, right? So the state only emerges once society is cleaved into classes and you have one group of exploiters and one group of exploited, and then you need a state in between them to keep the exploited in their place, make sure they keep working for the enrichment of the exploiters. This is when the state emerges. So until you get rid of that relationship of exploited and exploiters, you can't fully start to dissolve the state. So Engels says the first goal of revolution shouldn't be to abolish authority, right? It shouldn't be like, we had our revolution, woo, let's get rid of all authority on day one, right? It should be to meet the needs of the workers, make sure people have education, make sure people are fed, make sure people have housing, and then, begin the withering of the state. But all this stuff is paid for through nationalization of industry, right? And people have this idea with the withering of the state, like it's supposed to happen like that. It's supposed to happen overnight. 1917 was when we got the first socialist experiment in history in the USSR. So countries have been working on this and battling the global bourgeoisie, and no country successfully withered their state apparatus yet. But that doesn't mean it can't happen, and that doesn't mean the countries who established socialism, like Cuba, Vietnam, China, haven't been battling, the global bourgeoisie, the global capitalist class who seeks to destroy everything they're trying to do and privatize everything so that private capitalists can reap the rewards. The first goal shouldn't be to abolish authority. It should be to meet the needs of the workers and defeat the bourgeoisie. And then revolutions themselves are one class claiming authority over another, right? Right now, the ruling class is the capitalist class. The proletariat needs to claim authority over that class and crush it, so we only have one class. So the revolution itself is authoritarian, right, in a way. In that right now, all authority is in the hands of the bourgeoisie, and after the revolution, the authority will be moved into the hands of the proletariat until we can move to a society without those classes existing at all, and then wither the state. Lenin says social democrats at the time would recognize the state while anarchists don't. Social democrats at the time were saying, we recognize the state exists, while anarchists don't even recognize the state exists at all, and that's the difference. And Lenin saying this is a straw man of anarchist ideas, but Marx and Engels actually engage with anarchist ideas, and they offer an alternative, right? Social democrats are saying, you guys ignore the state, we pay attention to the state, you need a slow transition to socialism. Anarchists are saying, no, just abolish the state. Marxists are saying, no, seize state power and use it to transfer the means of production from the hands of the ruling class into the hands of the workers. All right, so that's the end of part 2. Let's do part 3. So part 3 is called Letter to Bebel. I think Bebel, B-E-B-E-L. I don't know. I read these things. I don't listen to them. Actually, the first time I listened to this, it was a book on tape. So maybe I should remember this dude's name, how it's pronounced. But anyways, Engels' letter here is critiquing the Gotha program, and that might sound familiar, critique of the Gotha program, because that is one of Marx's most famous works. So if you want more on this idea, read Critique of the Gotha program. It's a great book, one of the foundational Marxist texts. But this is Engels' letter to this guy, Babul, critiquing the Gotha program. So the Gotha program said there can be a people's free state, right? You can have a state that works at the behest of the people. And Lenin says there can be no people's free state. The state is needed to crush reactionaries and must be withered afterwards, if people are truly going to be free. There can be no power with a monopoly on violence if people are actually free, right? Because then they're subservient to that power with the monopoly on violence. So the state needs to be withered. Our goal shouldn't be a people's free state. Our goal should be a stateless, classless society, according to Engels. The goal always needs to be the abolition of the state, and Engels says the party shouldn't use the term people's free state as a goal, but instead he suggests a different German word meaning community, which is basically what I just said. So the state defends a minority and ensures the exploitation of the majority. And the end goal of communism is to have no exploiters and no exploited. So therefore you don't need a state. When you no longer need to hold the exploited in check for the enrichment of the exploiters, the apparatus which does so is no longer needed. The debate going on between anarchists and social democrats at the time, anarchists are saying we need no state, social democrats are saying we need a people's state, and Marx, Engels, and Lenin are saying, no, you're both wrong, we need to seize the state and wither it. And that's basically it for chapter 3. For part 3. Part 3 is real short. So yeah, there's chapter 4, is part 1, 2, and 3. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope it gave you a good recap. Please leave your comments below. I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. And I'm going to still go start working on parts 4, 5, and 6. Just kidding. I'm probably going to take a shower and then go do some other stuff. But 4, 5, and 6 will hopefully be coming real soon. All right, thanks for watching, everyone. Peace.